sore wrists, papyrus cuts, and serving a pharaoh who thinks he's literally a god. Welcome to the miserable existence of an ancient Egyptian scribe, where your entire life is spent hunched over, writing things down for people who will never, ever thank you. Now, you might be thinking, but wait, weren't scribes elite members of society? Didn't they avoid hard physical labor and get to learn fancy hieroglyphics? Well, yes. The same way being the only person who knows how to reset the office Wi-Fi makes you elite. It's a privilege that quickly becomes a prison. Let me tell you the tale of Thutmose Wadjet, scribe to the royal court during the reign of Ramesses II, and why his supposedly prestigious career was actually a never-ending scroll of misery. Our story begins at the House of Life, the educational institution where young Thutmose spent his childhood, having the joy beaten out of him alongside his ability to hold a reed brush properly. While other boys his age were outside playing, swimming in the Nile, or learning practical trade skills, Thutmose spent 12 years memorizing over 700 hieroglyphic symbols. "Bend your back, boy," his instructor would shout, smacking him with a palm rib whenever his posture straightened even slightly. A good scribe works until his fingers bleed and his spine curves like the crescent moon. By the time Thutmose graduated at age 17, his body had already begun to transform into the recognized shape of his profession. Hunched shoulders, squinted eyes, and a permanent indentation on his right middle finger where the reed brush rested. But hey, at least he wasn't building pyramids. That's what his father kept telling him. "You're using your mind, son. You're special. Special enough to develop arthritis by age 25, it turns out." Now employed in the royal administration, Thutmose discovered the first horrible truth of being a scribe. Everyone assumes you have nothing better to do than write down their thoughts. "Thutmose, record my new decree about grain taxation." "Thutmose, I need an inventory of all items in the Eastern storehouse." "Thutmose, write down what I had for breakfast. I think it's giving me digestive issues." Each day began before dawn. Thutmose would grind his inkstone, carefully mixing soot and water into a thick black paste. Then he'd chew the end of his reed brush until it frayed into a usable writing instrument. With his palette balanced on one knee, he'd begin transcribing whatever nonsense the court officials demanded. One particularly memorable morning, the royal treasurer summoned Thutmose urgently. "I need you to record the arrival of tribute from Nubia," the treasurer announced. 5 hours. 5 hours Thutmose sat in the blazing sun, cataloging every copper ingot, every bag of gold dust, every exotic animal and slave that passed before the pharaoh's throne. His water ran out after the first hour. By the third hour, sweat had dripped onto his papyrus, smudging 3 columns of careful notation, which meant he'd have to recopy the entire document later. When a passing servant took pity and brought him a cup of water, the treasurer barked, "No refreshments for the scribe. His hands must remain dry." The second horrible truth about being a scribe: you're responsible for everything you write, but have authority over none of it. When Thutmose recorded that the Nubian gold weighed 50 deben, he was staking his life on that measurement. If later someone claimed it was 49 or 51 deben, guess who would be flogged? Not the treasurer who counted it. Not the official who accepted it. The scribe who wrote it down. One afternoon, while recording an important religious ceremony, Thutmose made a slight error. Instead of writing, "The divine pharaoh honors Ammonius Ra," he accidentally wrote, "The divine pharaoh honors Ammonius Re," a minor variant spelling of the god's name. The high priest noticed. "Do you dare alter the name of the great sun god?" The priest hissed, his bald head gleaming with ceremonial oils. "This is blasphemy." Thutmose spent the next 3 days copying religious texts as penance, sleeping only when he physically collapsed over his work. When he finally returned to his regular duties, his hands were so cramped he could barely hold his brush. The third horrible truth about being a scribe in ancient Egypt: despite your literacy giving you theoretical access to knowledge and power, you spend most of your time writing things so fundamentally boring they could mummify a man's soul. Record the number of cattle in the northern province. List every tree in the pharaoh's garden. Count how many bricks were used in the new granary. And God's help you if you made an arithmetic error. Mathematical precision was expected, despite having to calculate using a system where 1/64th was written as a vulture over a basket. One spring, during the annual flooding of the Nile, Thutmose was assigned to record the height of the river each day. This meant waking up before sunrise, trudging through mud to the Nilometer, recording the measurement, then reporting back to officials who would decide taxation rates based on his findings. On the third day of measurement, he slipped on the muddy bank and dropped his writing equipment into the Nile. The palette sank immediately. The brushes floated away. The ink dissolved in a black cloud. Panicking, Thutmose ran back to report what happened, only to find the royal overseer waiting with crossed arms. "Where is today's measurement?" the overseer demanded. I lost my writing tools in the river, sir," Thutmose stammered. "And did the river cease to exist because you dropped your brush? Go back, measure it, memorize the figure, then report to me. Then you can make new tools on your own time." By the time Thutmose completed all his duties that day, it was well past midnight. He spent what remained of the night carving a new palette, cutting new reeds for brushes, and mixing fresh ink. He slept for perhaps an hour before beginning the next day's work. But surely there were perks, right? The respect of being among the 1% of Egyptians who could read and write? The satisfaction of preserving history? Well, not exactly. Because here's the fourth horrible truth. Everyone assumes you're cheating them. Tax collectors suspected Thutmose was skimming funds. Laborers believed he was misrecording their work hours. Officials thought he was spying for other officials. "I don't trust that quiet one with the palette," Thutmose once overheard a nobleman say. "Always watching, always writing. What's he writing about me? I wonder." The irony, of course, was that Thutmose was too exhausted to engage in any kind of scheming. Between his official duties, the mandatory copying of texts to practice his skills, and the private commissions he took on to earn extra grain rations, he barely had time to sleep, let alone plot anyone's downfall. The physical toll was another joy entirely. By 30, Thutmose had developed chronic back pain from hunching over his work, an infected abscess where his reed brush constantly rubbed against his finger, deteriorating eyesight from squinting at tiny hieroglyphics, a persistent cough from inhaling papyrus dust. When he visited a physician about his back pain, the doctor prescribed a poultice of donkey dung and honey to be applied while reciting prayers to Thoth, the god of scribes. "Thoth gives you this pain as a gift," the physician explained solemnly. "It is the mark of your sacred profession." Thutmose might have pointed out that Thoth, depicted with the head of an ibis, had a perfectly straight spine and probably didn't suffer from hemorrhoids caused by sitting on stone benches 12 hours a day. But questioning the gods was not an advisable career move. Speaking of career moves, there weren't any. Being a scribe wasn't just a job. It was a lifelong sentence. Once your hands were permanently stained with ink and your back permanently bent, what else could you do? You couldn't suddenly decide to become a farmer or a soldier. You were a scribe until death or until you went blind, whichever came first. The final horrible truth? After a lifetime of recording other people's words, deeds, and accomplishments, almost no one would remember Thutmose's name. His work would outlive him by thousands of years, but history would recall the pharaohs, the generals, and even the architects, not the man who recorded their glory. At the end of his career, Thutmose had one small comfort. When preparing for his own modest tomb, nowhere near the splendor of those whose inventories he'd so carefully catalogued, he was finally able to write his own story. He composed a brief autobiographical text to be carved on his burial stela. After 47 years of writing exactly what others told him to write, he could finally express himself. His epitaph read, "Thutmose Wadjet, royal scribe, who served faithfully for 47 years. His fingers never rested, his eyes never closed, his back never straightened. May Thoth welcome him to a peaceful afterlife where the papyrus is always smooth, the ink never blots, and no one ever says, 'Just one more list before you go.'" 3,000 years later, archaeologists found his tomb. They were thrilled by the discovery, not because of Thutmose himself, but because the inventory of grave goods, he'd recorded provided valuable insight into middle-class burial practices of the period. Even in death, it was his lists that mattered, not the man who wrote them. The ultimate scribe's curse, to spend eternity as a footnote in someone else's story, with a permanently cramped hand and not even a decent brush to show for it.